So when it first came out in 2002, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker was not received super well, to put it lightly. This was a time when the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox had first come out, which offered graphical enhancements that were just nothing like people had ever seen before after the previous generations. And the more goofy, cartoony, cel-shaded look of Wind Waker just maybe didn't sit as well with some people. It's been nearly 20 years since, and it's certainly fair to say that people have warmed up to this game a little bit during that time, due I'm sure in no small part to the fact that its cartoony look has caused it to age somewhat better than its peers at the time, which were going for a more lifelike, realistic visual style, which quickly started to feel a little bit dated as graphics technology rapidly improved in the coming years. This, I'm sure, has nothing to do with the fact that cel shading tends to be one of the more commonly requested things for me to cover in the GameMaker tutorial videos that I like to make. Hello all you crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and it's finally time to talk about cel shading. Okay. I'm kind of waiting for Link to do some funny animation, some funny idle animation like he's about to sneeze or something, but he's just not doing it. Alright. So I'm going to put the game down and stop running around Outset Island because I was actually playing the game there and not just talking and editing and reference footage later. So there are a couple components to cel shading, to the cel shading effect. I am not going to be talking about everything today. I am specifically going to be talking about lighting in this video. You can see the lighting moving around Link's head and body as I rotate the light in this little demo program. This is arguably the most important part because you can see there's really two stages to lighting here. There's light fully on, and there is shadow fully on, as opposed to the more smooth gradient look that you would get in regular lighting. So just like I did with last week's video about water shaders, I'm going to be plugging a video from this guy called Michael Jasper I tried. I will have a link to it down in the description. It is a very nice high-level overview of how the effect works. Even if you are already more or less familiar with how cel shading works, I still recommend watching it because it's really well put together and it's really fun to watch. Additionally, a few months after that, he made another longer form video with one of his friends about lighting and some other technical art details, which is also worth a watch, although it's an hour 17 minutes long, so it may be a bit much to watch all in one sitting. It's still a lot of fun to hear them talk about the different technical details of Nintendo games, though. Also, and this is a bit of a standard disclaimer for these shader videos now, this is going to be building on a bunch of different things about shaders that I've covered in the past in videos. You are definitely going to want to know about how textures work, how things like surface normals work, how vertex normals work. I made a series of videos on 3D lighting, point lights, spotlights, and directional lights over the summer. And those are going to be very relevant indeed because this is at its core a lighting effect, this Toon shader effect. And I'm going to be making this video with the assumption that you have watched those videos and you understand how lighting works. So, there are, as you may be aware, a few components to Toon shader effects. I am not going to be talking about everything in this video, I am just going to be talking about the lighting. I do plan to make at least one and probably at least two more videos about Toon shading in the future at some point, but for now we're just going to be talking about lighting. So you see here, there's this model of Link from the Wind Waker, and he's got a very goofy expression on his face. All of the expressions that Link has in Wind Waker are varying degrees of goofy, but I chose this one. And anyway, as I rotate the light around him, you can see the different lighting effect is either 100% on the parts of his body that are facing the sun, or are 100% in shadow on the parts that are facing away from the sun. This contrasts against the usual 3D lighting effects where, especially if you're doing it in the fragment shader, you're going to have a more smooth transition over rounded shapes from light to shadow. So that's what we're going to have when we end this video. What we're going to start with now is going to be basically an empty 3D test scene with a model of Link in the middle. This is Link with a smooth point light shining on him. It's not exactly smooth. There's a little bit of faceted shading around his sleeves there. But otherwise, this is a 3D object of Link with a smooth point light on him. I got this model from the Wind Waker page on the models resource. I will have a link to that in the video description as well. I did have to do a little bit of work to put all of these things together, all of the textures together on the same in the same file, because when you're doing things in GameMaker, it's generally easier to have all of your models' textures on the same image file. If you don't want to go through the trouble of doing that, if you look in the GitHub repository in the video description, the link model and his textures should all be there in the form of a D3D GameMaker model. You can just load that into the game using the our good old friend load model, which is a script, which I wrote a long time ago at the beginning of the series. So right now, I've done a little bit of initial setup. I have created a shader called shader_toon. It doesn't really do anything. This is really just a basic 3D lighting shader. There is no toon shading going on in here yet. This is just so that I don't have to go through the whole song and dance of creating a spotlight all over again. I'm also, and I have not done this ahead of time, this just occurred to me now, I will go and write a little bit of code to rotate link. I've written a little bit of code just now to rotate Link on the spot. This is just so that you can hit the Q and E keys and make him spin, and you can see him responding to lighting from different angles. This is just going to make it easier to see the lighting effect later on. Okay. So the basis of this effect, if you remember from Michael Ashworth's video, is going to be what is called a ramp texture. And a ramp texture, much like the displacement, distortion texture, whatever you wanted to call it from the water video, is going to be a secondary texture that you load into the shader via a sampler. And instead of drawing with it directly, you use it instead to modify the final image in some other way. So if I were to open this file up on my computer and make it bigger because it is impossibly tiny right now, this is a 1x256, or really a 256x1 image, and all it is a gradient. It starts off with black on the left side and it goes to white on the other side, and there is a bit of a transition period in the middle. I'm actually going to load this into GameMaker so that, let's call it sprite tunification. I'm going to load this into GameMaker, and it might actually be easier to see in GameMaker than it will just be in the image viewer on my computer. So you can see this is a long 256x1 rectangle of color gradient. This one in particular is not the actual color gradient ramp texture that is used in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. I just generated this gradient in Photoshop. It should be close enough for our purposes, and you will be able to see later on what happens when you modify this this tunification ramp texture. So first, let's bring this into the shader, and I can say that with uniform sampler 2D. Let's call it ramp. I should probably call it like ramp text or something like that, just so that we know what it is. And we can submit this to the Toon shader using, that won't really do it, will it? Var sampler Toon ramp. That's a variable name, that'll do. Shader get sampler ID. Shader get sampler ID? Shader get sampler index. Toon shader, and this was what? Ramp text. And once we have that, once we have the index of the ramp textures sampler, we can actually put a texture into the shader in that sampler index by saying texture get set stage, and the sampler ID for that is going to be sampler Toon ramp, and the texture ID is going to be sprite get texture. Okay, this should be starting to get pretty familiar. I've done it in a number of videos now. So if we just want to see that this is actually working and operational, if you want, you can substitute in the ramp texture for the GameMaker base texture, although I will warn you, this is not actually going to look like much. It's just going to be like Link. Oh, yes, that's right. That's even worse than it was supposed to look, because I meant to hit the separate texture page box on this ramp texture when I loaded it in, and I forgot. So this isn't going to look like much. This is just going to be a pretty much Link with various stripes of black and white, and he looks fairly undead and slightly creepy this way. That's not really how Link normally looks, I don't think. Anyway, we know that the ramp texture is being loaded into the shader properly. We can undo that. So, and I'm going to maximize this this code window now to give me a little bit more space. So the part of this lighting code that will be specifically affected by the ramp texture is going to be this n.l value over here. N.l is the dot product of the direction of the incoming light ray and the surface normal of each fragment. It's going to have a value between 0 and 1. If you remember, a value of 0 for n.l means that the light is going to be in full shadow. It is not going to receive any light, and the starting color is going to just be blended with the ambient color, which is probably going to be a black or a dark gray or something. And an n.l value of 1 is going to mean that the fragment is hitting the light face on and that it's going to be fully illuminated, which is the color that it would be if it was unlit. It's going to be the color obtained from the texture and the vertex color blended together. And an n.l value somewhere in the middle is going to be a partially lit pixel fragment on the screen. So it'll be somewhere in between the ambient color and the actual color. Most of the time, this is just going to be a smooth transition. As I said, when I ran the game earlier, there is a smooth transition between the fully illuminated side of Link, which is like right about here, and the fully shadowed side of Link, which is more over here. And you can see a smooth gradient. We want something a little bit different from that. We want the fragments that are mostly illuminated to suddenly become fully 100% illuminated, and the fragments that are mostly shadowed to become fully 100% fully shadowed, fully unlit. And there's just going to be a rather harsh cutoff in between, as opposed to the smooth transition that you see here. And we can do that using the ramp texture. So n.l over here contains a value between 0 and 1, and if you're familiar with texture coordinates, which you should be at this point, you will be aware that texture coordinates also range from 0 to 1, meaning that we can pretty simply use the result of this dot product calculation as a texture coordinate. This ramp texture over here only happens to exist on really the horizontal axis. It is a 256 by 1 pixel tall image. So we really only need the horizontal texture coordinate. We don't really need to play with the vertical texture coordinate. We can just make that 0 or 1, or it doesn't really matter because it's only 1 pixel tall. And we can declare a vector 2 and call it something like, let's go with n.l text or something like that. And we can construct a vector 2 using n.l on the horizontal axis, and let's just go with 0 on the vertical axis. And we can look up a value on the ramp texture using this vector 2. And we can call that something like vector 4. Let's go with n.l ramp. You can call it whatever you want. There's probably a better thing to name this that I am just not familiar with. And we can set that to the result of texture 2D, and instead of using the base texture, this can be the ramp text, and the texture coordinate can be n.l underscore text. Hi, this is Michael from the future. I was right about to post this video when I realized that I forgot to mention something that's kind of important. So in this section of the video right here, I completely gloss over the color that you look up on the ramp texture itself. In this recording right here, I just do the RGB to grayscale thing, partially just to keep things simple so that it turns into a floating point value instead of a vector 4, and partially just like out of habit. But it's equally valid and honestly probably more useful to actually use the ramp texture's color to affect the lighting color. This won't really change much of the code. You just would use the texture lookup itself as a vector 4 instead of condensing it into a single floating point value. It doesn't really change the math or anything, since you are equally allowed to multiply a vector 4 by another vector 4 when you calculate the final color instead of multiplying a vector 4 by a float. I don't want to get too far into this today because there are a lot of other fun things you can do with this to use the ramp texture to adjust the light in other ways. That is one of the several future Toon shader videos that I want to make. For now, I would just like to acknowledge that such a thing does exist, but for today we're just going to be going with the grayscale version to keep things simple. Back to the video. Anyway, this will be a floating point number. Let's say this to a variable also. I'm going to call this float. Let's call it n.l adjusted or something along those lines. And now we have another number between 0 and 1. This is the dot product of the light, except it has been adjusted based on the ramp texture. And now instead of using n.l itself, in this last line down here to determine the final color, we can substitute in n.l underscore adjusted. And that is our effect. This is pretty simple, actually. It's only a couple lines of code. So now you can see, if I shine the light on Link, the mostly illuminated sides from before are now fully illuminated. And here over on this side, lighting values that are mostly in shadow are now fully in shadow. And there's a little bit of weirdness going on with his arm because this model is not perfect. I may have messed up a little bit when it comes to defining the normals when I was combining things on this model. But that's okay. You can see the effect going on here. So, getting back to this ramp texture, you can kind of do whatever you want here. I've been saying that a lot in these shader videos recently, I know, but the whole point of this is that you have more control over how your game is rendered and how lighting works and whatever you happen to think is visually pleasing. If I were to go and edit this image a little bit and do something such as, let's see if I'm good at using the sprite editor in GameMaker nowadays. I could go and shift the gradient to the left a little bit, and then I will have to actually recolor the sprite here so that it's not interrupted, so that it's actually white on the right side. This is going to cause much more of Link to be illuminated. This is going to cause the shadow cutoff to be in a different place. You can see now. Before, the cutoff was kind of like running down the middle of his body bilaterally, and now it's much more on his right side, and he's much more in sun than he was before. If I were to move it the other way instead, which you are equally allowed to do, much more of Link would be in shadow. And if I can actually move it in the correct place, that'll do. Much more of Link would be in shadow, and only a little bit of his body would actually be illuminated. For some reason, this is not. The paint bucket tool is having issues. There we go. That'll go. That'll do. This will cause much more of Link to be in shadow than before. You can see only a little bit on this side is now illuminated. If I were to rotate him, by the way, you would see that it works anywhere. I forgot to do that. The whole point of writing that little bit of rotation code at the beginning was so that you could see this, and I forgot. Anyway, let's undo all of this. You could also make the actual transition in the middle a little bit more harsh. So if I were to, let's say, go completely from black to white, this would be a 100% cutoff. There would be no intermediate section in the middle. And this is much more like what actual Wind Waker does. It doesn't have the little gradient in the middle, and you can now see. If I were to rotate Link around, there's not much. The fuzzing on his sleeves are gone. Although I'm pretty sure if I had made the model correct, it wouldn't have been in there in the first place. The cutoff is much harsher than it was before. You could also. You also don't have to just have a completely on-off binary gradient. If you wanted to, and I believe Wind Waker also does this, you could have, for example, a dark gray for a little bit, and then you could have a lighter gray for a little bit between the actual. That's a little bit long. You could have a lighter gray, and you could have the transition work in steps. And this would cause Link to have different levels of shadow on him, but they would still be all hard cutoffs. Again, this is a little bit closer to what actual Wind Waker does. Although, this is a little bit dramatic. This is probably a little bit more dramatic than what actual Wind Waker does. So definitely play with this. See what you like. I happen to like, let's see. I don't know if I like the brighter part of that. I think I like it mostly illuminated. I think, let's see, I think this gradient looks best. So there's a little bit of shadow, but there's mostly like full sunlight. Okay. So a little mathematical thing to note. This does not affect the attenuation value, and as you get farther away from a point or spotlight source, you'll still get darker gradually, and you will not see the piecewise, stepwise decrease in brightness the same way that you would with the n.l. You could very well include this in this ramp texture business over here. I am not going to do that. I am going to assign that as homework or something. Like I keep saying over and over again, play with these values, play with these calculations, see what you like. After a certain point in shader code, as long as it looks the way you want it to look, it doesn't really matter if it's considered correct math or not, or if the code is the same as other people's. Okay. I guess I'll run this again just because it looks cool and I like having it on the screen. So this is a basic introduction to toon shading. I'm going to call it toon shading just because it's easier to say. Toon shading and cell shading refer to the same effect. They both refer to this, but toon comes from the word cartoon because it tends to look cartoony, and cell refers to one of the art materials that would have been used to draw this on like a physical medium in like animation in the 20th century. I'm going to go with toon shading because it's much easier to say. Like I said, there's more to this. Another big part of the visual style in The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is color tones. So at different times of day, the colors on Link and on everything else will be slightly different. That is definitely a story for another day. Another big part of cell shading... I automatically went to cell shading. Another big part of the toon shading effect is an outline around objects. I did a video a while ago on what I like to call fake outlines, which is essentially, in a nutshell, just drawing an inside-out copy of an object, slightly offset from the original. But I think the time is approaching where I want to talk about how real outlines will be calculated, since they tend to show up in toon shaders. Anyway, I won't say that I'm going to make videos on those things immediately, but I do want to do them sooner rather than later. There is also another video on the water effect that I want to make. It has more to do with water in 3D than just water in 2D, like the last video. That's probably going to come next week or something like that, depending on how much time I have. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute towards these videos being made, the link to that is in all the usual places. Otherwise, if you want to look at and download the code that was written in this video, GitHub repository in the video description as usual. Again, if you want this model of Link without having to fiddle around on the models resource, that'll be included in the GitHub also. Otherwise, I hope you all found that interesting, and I will see you all later. I really need to play more of Wind Waker one of these days. I played a little bit of it, but my time keeps getting consumed by other things. I should get on that. Special thanks to Edward Holt, Indie Punch, Jason, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want your name in the credits or to hear yourself shouted out at the end, head over to the Patreon page in the video description to join the fun.